Have you ever been in that situation where you're like sitting across from a therapist
Mm-hmm.
or even just thinking about maybe taking that step,
Yeah,
and it just feels like you've walked into this whole new world
right.
with all these like unspoken rules and expectations,
Absolutely.
and it can be so personal, and sometimes it feels like you're just kind of fumbling around in the dark a little bit.
It's a very common feeling, actually. And
Yeah,
and, it, and it's really important, I think, for people to remember that in that therapeutic space,
right.
you as the client have certain like fundamental rights.
Yeah.
And the therapist has clear responsibilities, and understanding those, I think, can really
Mm.
set the stage for a more trusting and an effective therapeutic experience.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what we are diving deep into today.
Yes.
We have got a really valuable resource here that outlines the legal and ethical guidelines for psychologists.
Okay.
Think of it as like an essential guide, a user manual almost for navigating therapy.
I like that.
And we're going to be focusing specifically on what you need to be aware of when it comes to client notices and informed consent.
Yeah, those are really important but often less discussed elements of the therapeutic process.
Except that.
So our goal today is really to unpack those a little bit.
Mhm.
Pull out the most important nuggets so that you feel, knowledgeable and confident about what to expect, what questions you might want to ask, just feeling empowered in that therapeutic relationship.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's jump right in and we'll start with something called client notices.
Okay.
This might not sound like the most exciting topic,
You're right.
but stick with us because it's actually about your basic right to be informed as a client.
Yeah.
There is specific information that therapists are legally required to provide to you and even display in their office.
Absolutely. So for instance, in California,
Okay.
there's a very specific notice to consumers that's actually required by law.
Interesting.
It's Business and Professions Code, Section 2936.
Okay, so this isn't just like a suggestion. This is a legal mandate.
It is a legal mandate, yeah.
Wow.
And it's in a very specific wording.
Okay, so what does it actually say?
So the notice has to say this, and it has to be posted in a clear and visible location in the therapist's office.
Got it.
It says, notice to consumers, the Department of Consumer Affairs Board of Psychology receives and responds to questions and complaints regarding the practice of psychology.
Mhm.
If you have questions or complaints, you will find the most recent contact information at www.psychology.k.gov.
Okay, so it's basically letting people know that if they have an issue that isn't being addressed by their therapist,
Right.
they have a way to like escalate that to a higher authority.
Exactly.
Interesting. Okay, so if you're in California and you don't see that very specific notice posted,
Right.
that might be a red flag.
That might be something to note. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, good to know.
Yeah.
And then there's another important notice we could talk about,
Yes.
and that is the IPA Notice of Privacy Practices.
Yes. The NPP.
The MPP, we've probably all seen something similar to this in other healthcare settings, right?
Absolutely. It's very common.
The document that explains how your health information is protected.
Right. So the NPP, which stems from HIPAA's privacy rule, details how your protected health information can and can't be used and shared.
Okay.
Psychologists are obligated to provide this to you either before or at your very first therapy session.
Got it.
You also have the right to request a copy of it at any time.
Okay.
And similar to that consumer notice, it should be readily available in the office and if the psychologist has a website
Mm-hmm.
on their website as well.
Okay, so the MPP is all about like data privacy.
Data privacy, yes.
Now, you mentioned a key distinction earlier between the NPP and informed consent.
Yes.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So the notice of privacy practices and informed consent, they serve very different but equally important purposes.
Okay.
The NPP is about informing you about your privacy rights,
Okay.
whereas informed consent, which we'll dive into more in a moment, is really about you actively agreeing to participate in therapy once you have a really good understanding of what that involves.
Got it.
So they're related but distinct.
Okay. That makes sense. One is about your information.
Right.
The other one is about your participation in the process.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's talk more about informed consent then.
Yes, let's do that.
You mentioned that it's more than just signing a form.
It is so much more than signing a form.
Yeah.
While there will likely be paperwork involved, informed consent is really an ongoing conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a fundamental process that underpins the ethical and often legal basis of therapy.
Okay.
Legally, there are 3 main conditions that need to be met
Okay.
for your consent to be considered truly informed.
Okay, so let's break those down one by one. What's the first legal cornerstone of informed consent?
The first is capacity.
Capacity.
And this means that you, as the client, have the ability to make rational decisions about your therapy.
Okay.
So, for example, our resource mentions someone who is significantly impaired by alcohol or drugs at the time of making the decision,
Right.
or someone who's experiencing a severe psychotic episode.
Okay.
They may not have the capacity in that moment
Right.
to fully understand and therefore consent to treatment.
That makes sense if someone's judgment is clouded.
Right.
They can't really give informed consent.
Exactly.
Okay, so what's the second condition?
The second is comprehension.
Okay.
So it's not enough for the therapist to just give you information.
Mhm.
They have to make sure that you actually understand it
Right.
well enough to make an informed decision about your treatment.
Okay.
The ethics code for psychologists actually specifically states that they have to use language that is reasonably understandable to the client.
Oh, so no, like throwing around a bunch of fancy jargon without explaining what it means.
Exactly right.
Right.
So the information provided should be, in clear everyday language, taking into account your reading level, your background knowledge.
Hmm.
And really importantly, you should have a genuine opportunity to ask questions and get clear answers.
So it's a two-way street.
It's absolutely a two-way street.
Yeah, okay. And what's the third condition?
The third is voluntariness.
Okay.
So your consent to participate in therapy must be freely given
Hmm.
without any pressure or coercion.
Right.
And this can get a little tricky sometimes.
Yeah.
Especially when therapy is suggested, say, by a family member or a partner,
Yeah.
and they're really encouraging you to go.
Right.
While that encouragement in and of itself isn't necessarily coercion,
Mm-hmm.
the final decision to participate in therapy has to be your own.
So someone can suggest therapy all they want,
Right.
but ultimately it's up to the client to decide whether or not they want to actually go.
Exact.
Okay, that's an important distinction.
It is. And our resource also brings up a really important point
Okay.
about court-ordered or mandated therapy.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So even in those situations where the choice to attend therapy might not feel voluntary,
The psychologist still has a professional obligation to inform you about the nature of the services you'll be receiving.
okay.
The fact that it's court-ordered, and really importantly, any limits to confidentiality that court order might impose.
No, limits to confidentiality in court-ordered therapy, that's definitely something people need to be aware of.
It is, and the source gives the example that, often the court needs to know whether you are attending your therapy sessions,
Okay.
and they may also require some general information about your treatment progress. So you need to be aware of those potential limits on confidentiality from the very beginning.
So even in mandated therapy, while showing up might not be voluntary,
Right.
your understanding of the process and its boundaries absolutely should be.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've covered the 3 legal conditions for informed consent.
Yes.
Now, our resource also talks about this distinction between the legal requirements
Yes.
and the ethical guidelines for informed consent in therapy.
Right.
Can you unpack that for us a little bit? Yeah, absolutely. So while there are some specific legal mentions of consent, particularly in California law,
Okay.
for instance, the requirement to obtain and document verbal or written consent for telehealth services,
Right.
the really detailed obligations and best practices around informed consent in therapy are primarily driven by the ethical standards of our profession as psychologists.
So the ethics code really provides a more in-depth framework for what constitutes proper informed consent,
Exactly.
going above and beyond the basic legal requirements.
Yes, and the ethics code contains several standards that specifically address informed consent.
Okay.
So Standard 3.10 offers some general guidelines that apply to all psychological activities.
Okay.
So whether it's conducting research, performing assessments, providing therapy,
Got it.
it reiterates the need for using understandable language and points out, the exceptions where consent isn't legally required.
Right.
It also specifically addresses situations where individuals can't legally give consent themselves, with emphasizing the need to provide an appropriate explanation, seek their assent whenever possible, consider their preferences,
Right.
and obtain permission from a legally authorized person.
Mm-hmm.
And really importantly, it stresses the duty to inform about court-ordered services
Yeah.
and any limits to confidentiality before proceeding with services.
Right.
This standard also highlights the importance of documenting the consent process, whether it's in writing or verbally.
So even if you verbally agree to participate in therapy, that agreement should ideally be noted by the therapist.
Yes, documenting the consent process is considered good professional practice.
Okay, then there's standard 10.01.
Yes.
Which is specifically focused on informed consent to therapy.
Exactly. And this standard emphasizes the importance of informing clients as early as is feasible in the therapeutic relationship
Okay.
about some key aspects of therapy.
Okay, what are those?
So things like the nature of the treatment, approach the anticipated course of therapy, the fees involved, the potential involvement of any third parties like insurance companies, and again, the limits of confidentiality.
Yeah.
And it really underscores the need to give you plenty of opportunity to ask questions
Right.
and get clear answers.
Yeah, the fees and financial aspects are something people should be clear on right from the start.
Absolutely. Financial transparency is a crucial part of ethical practice.
Right. To avoid any unexpected costs down the line.
Exactly.
Okay. So standard 10.1 also includes some specific requirements for situations where the therapy techniques being used are relatively new
Yes.
or not yet widely established.
Right. In those cases, the therapist has a responsibility to inform you about the developing nature of that treatment.
Okay.
Any potential risks that might be associated with it, alternative treatments that are available,
Mm-hmm.
and the fact that your participation is completely voluntary.
That seems really important, especially if you're considering a type of therapy that's not super well known.
Yeah, absolutely.
You want to have a really clear picture of what you're getting into. You do.
Okay, and then finally, if the therapist is a trainee,
Yes.
meaning they're still in the process of getting their full licensure,
Right.
Standard 10.01 requires that you be informed of that
Absolutely.
and that they're receiving supervision from a fully licensed psychologist.
Correct.
And you should be provided with the name of their supervisor.
Yes.
And that the supervisor is ultimately legally responsible for the treatment you receive.
Exactly.
Right.
It's really valuable for clients to understand the experience level
Yeah.
and the supervision structure of the person that they're working with.
You have a right to know who you're working with and what their qualifications are and what that supervision framework looks like.
For sure.
Okay, now, our resource also mentions Standard 9.03,
Mm-hmm.
which addresses informed consent in the context of assessments.
Yeah.
While our primary focus today is on therapy,
Right.
what are the main points to know from that standard? Sure.
What
So Standard 9.03 basically outlines the requirement for informed consent before conducting any assessments, evaluations, or diagnostic services.
Okay.
However, it does specify some exceptions to that.
Oh, okay. What are those?
So, for instance, when testing is legally mandated,
Oh.
like in the certain forensic situations,
Got it.
or when consent is implied in routine educational or organizational activities, like a job application where testing is just a standard part of the process.
Right.
Or when the primary purpose of the testing is to evaluate someone's capacity to make decisions for themselves.
Okay. So generally speaking, you should be aware if you're undergoing any kind of psychological assessment
Right.
and understand why,
Yes.
unless it falls under one of those specific exceptions.
Exactly.
Okay. And across all of these ethical standards,
Yeah.
what's the overarching theme? Like what ties all of this together?
It's really a deep respect, I think, for your autonomy as a client.
Mm-hmm.
And your fundamental right to make informed decisions about your mental health care journey?
Okay, so to kind of sum up everything we've talked about,
Yeah.
we've discussed the legal requirements for client notices.
Right.
Those specific pieces of information your therapist is obligated to post in their office and provide to you.
Correct.
And then we've really unpacked this concept of informed consent,
Yes.
emphasizing that it's not just a one-time form that you sign,
Right.
but it's an ongoing process
It is.
that involves your capacity to understand the information,
Mm-hmm.
the therapist's responsibility to explain things clearly,
Yes.
and your voluntary agreement to participate.
Absolutely.
And we talked about some specific situations like court-ordered therapy
Right.
and the use of new or less established treatment methods.
Yeah, and it's so important to remember that, this is not just like a static event.
Mm-hmm.
Informed consent is an ongoing dialogue.
Right.
As your therapy progresses, new issues might arise or changes in approach might be considered
That's right.
that require further discussion and your continued consent.
Okay, so for you, our listener, the key takeaway here is that you have a right to be well informed.
You do.
You should expect to receive these specific notices that we talked about.
Yes.
And to have open and honest conversations with your therapist
Yes.
about the nature of your therapy,
Yeah.
potential benefits and risks, the costs involved,
Mm-hmm.
the limits of confidentiality, any other factors that could influence your decision to participate.
Exactly. And, this knowledge really empowers you to be an active and engaged participant
Yeah.
in your therapeutic journey rather than just feeling like you're passively going along with the process.
Absolutely. Don't be afraid to ask questions if anything feels unclear
Right.
or you want more information. It is absolutely your right and often the therapist's ethical and legal obligation
Yeah,
to provide you with clear clarification.
exactly.
So be confident in seeking that understanding.
A good therapist will welcome those questions and view informed consent as a truly collaborative process,
Yeah,
working together to make sure that you feel comfortable and informed every step of the way.
absolutely. So considering all the information we've explored today, what does truly informed consent in a therapeutic relationship mean to you beyond just the paperwork?
Yeah.
It's about that continuous dialogue,
Yeah.
the clarity of understanding, and ultimately feeling empowered in the choices you make throughout your therapy.
I think that's a great point to end on.
It's definitely something to reflect on.